Hello, everybody. We're really excited that you could join us today for our discussion on Azure landing zones. Just give us a moment, please, while we pull up some slides, and then we'll get the party started. Thank you once again for joining us. We're here today to talk about Azure landing zones. We get a lot of inquiries around how our clients can use Azure landing zones as part of cloud implementations and migrations, but increasingly we're getting more and more questions around, now that I've completed this migration, how can I use Azure landing zones while I maintain and manage my environment? So today we'll be talking a little bit about what landing zones are, how our clients use them, what are some use cases that we see. We are going to have a panel-like discussion around some of the real challenges that our clients see in their day-to-day environments. We'll provide a little bit of best practice and key considerations that you can reference as part of your Azure landing zones implementation and your Azure cloud environment. First, to start off, I'd like to share a little bit about Netrix and who we are. We partner with our clients to solve IT problems. We serve in an advisory capacity, so we work with our clients to come up with design guidelines and how they can achieve some of the IT outcomes that they would like to attain as part of their implementation. We provide professional services to help guide our clients through the design, the implementation. And then we also work with our clients to ensure that their environments are running efficiently on an ongoing basis. While we provide services across a wide range of IT services and infrastructure, for the purpose of our discussion today, we'll be talking more about Microsoft specifically. We've had a long-standing strategic partnership with Microsoft. In fact, we've been partners for 17 years. We provide services across 4 core solution areas, including modern work, security, digital and app innovation, and of course, infrastructure. And we've achieved specializations also as part of those solution areas. So if you're attending this webinar, you're likely familiar with Azure landing zones. They really serve as a blueprint for ongoing success. As I mentioned, a lot of our clients benefit from Azure landing zones as part of an initial cloud implementation where they can take advantage of the modularized approach that landing zones provide, a uniformity in identity and network topology, resource allocation, business continuity. But you also have the benefit of using Azure landing zones on a continual or ongoing basis to achieve efficiency, not only as part of your initial migration, but as you manage your cloud services. So with Azure landing zones, you're able to deploy and manage Azure with confidence. You can really maintain a steady and predictable foundation for Azure, ensure that your resources are secure continuously, and you can manage Azure with minimal friction, thanks to the role-based controls and security infrastructure. But without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce you to your presenters for today. I'm joined with Tom Lilly and Joe Griffith, and they're really going to facilitate a discussion around things that they've seen on the front lines when working with our clients, solving real-world problems. So I'm really excited to hand the baton over to Tom and Joe. We're going to continue our discussion about Azure landing zones.
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. And thank you once again, everybody, for joining this webinar. So my name is Tom Lilly, as mentioned earlier. I am joined by Joe Griffith as well, who's going to be helping me with this discussion here today. So Joe, we've got time. Let's go ahead and dive right into it. Where would you like to start this conversation?
Sounds great. So one of the things I think is a pressing question for customers is, why would we want to use or leverage a landing zone?
And that's a big question that I hear from a lot of our clients today. As Sarah was putting up earlier within the slides, it's definitely a set of various items that we can use to standardize an environment as well as secure it. So the important thing that we really get down to is things like, how do we ensure that all of our resources are deployed the same way every single time? How do we ensure that everything is secured properly? How do we ensure that we are following our best practices as an organization? Or maybe for some of our clients who are regulated, like maybe they're in the energy sector, maybe they're in financial services, maybe they are in other countries or in the EU and have to abide by GDPR. All these things we want to make sure are a part of the environment without being intrusive to an actual deployment. So as we start talking about how do we ensure that the environment's deployed the right way every single time, landing zones really become that foundational component of the environment to make that happen. And that's really where we start to see those get to be deployed to ensure that everything works as expected.
Terrific. That's a really good explanation for that area, and I think our customers will find that useful. So, with that in mind, what would be some downsides if you already have an environment but are not using landing zones today?
I mean, I will let's have a discussion about a couple recent clients that we both work with, Joe, to kind of illustrate the effect of not having a good standardized environment. So obviously not going to give names for obvious reasons, but we did have a client whose budget for their Azure spend was around $15,000 to $20,000 a month. And when they began and they started doing deployments, this all worked really well. They were well within this budget and they were very happy with it. But as they went to do their deployments, they kept growing and growing and growing, as most of our clients do as they start consuming Azure services. So they came to us at the point where they're reaching about $35,000 to $40,000 a month in spend, which is roughly double the budget that they were planning on. So by not having those landing zones in place, not having the information, not having the visibility, not having those policies or things in place that we're going to talk about later, they were blowing way past their budget. And even at the same time, they weren't able to monitor it effectively because they didn't know the tooling available to them. So if they had a landing zone in place, they would have had budgets, they would have had controls in place to make sure people weren't deploying things that were too large. And overall, it would have reduced their spend overall over time. Now, we were able to get them into a good place eventually, but obviously during that interim period, there was some additional spend. There was another client that we had worked with as well that, Joe, you're very familiar with, that actually had a security incident, unfortunately. They kept a device open to the internet, and somebody was able to get into it through RDP and brute force the machine and then move within the rest of the environment. So by using Azure landing zones and putting the proper security policies and tooling in place, whether it's first or third party, we can keep those kind of things from happening, or at least make it really difficult for malicious actors to get in and do some things like that.
Those are really great stories, and I think that'll resonate with many different people that are in the same situation. I'd like to get into some more of those details here in just a little bit. Before we go there, what would you say are some misperceptions around adopting landing zones to begin with?
Yeah, whenever we're having these discussions, it's really two major things that we talk about when it comes to landing zones, that we kind of have to dispel that fear, uncertainty, doubt, that FUD around them. And the first and major one is that landing zones are only for larger, complex environments. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a lot of larger customers who are most certainly using landing zones to their fullest extent. They have full enterprise scale deployments, which Joe will talk about here in just a little bit. They're leveraging everything that we're going to be talking about around Azure policy, role-based access control, privileged identity management, et cetera, to ensure that they're essentially securing and deploying these environments as they should be. However, I will say that we have a lot of smaller clients that also take advantage of landing zones. It isn't always going to be enterprise scale. It could be a smaller iteration. It could be just a subset of features, but any company of any size, no matter what your planned Azure footprint is going to be, is absolutely you can absolutely take advantage of landing zones. You don't have to be one of these big Fortune 50 companies on Azure to use them effectively. And then the other big topic that we usually hear about that we're going to be talking about mostly today as part of this webinar is that landing zones are only for greenfield deployments, that they're really only useful if you don't have an Azure presence today. because they're meant to be that foundational component, and there's no great way to back rev your services to actually fit into a landing zone after it's been deployed. And hopefully as part of this webinar, everybody kind of feels that that's not necessarily the case, that absolutely landing zones can fit into the brownfield environments that you may be running today.
That's fantastic. Really good information. I'm looking forward to going through some of the rest of the topics we have here for everybody. I did want to ask, though, what are some challenges that customers can address by using landing zones in a brownfield environment?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things that we see is operational efficiency. You all may have seen this in Azure Advisor if you're familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't necessarily sure what that means, operational efficiency means really running an environment in an efficient manner. It's getting all the information out of it that you can in a very short amount of time. It's identifying who is going to own and operate and maintain and update any of the services that are out there, both IaaS and PaaS. There are a lot of ways that we can make this work, or that we implement operational efficiency within an environment. We're going to talk about these quite a bit as we get into some future topics, but things like tagging policies to ensure that the metadata is there for our services. Obviously, things like naming conventions, so you know what's out there. Azure policy is a huge component of landing zones that we can actually apply to our existing services as well as ones that will be deployed in the future. And then obviously integrating an infrastructure as code solution for standardized deployments. All those lend themselves very well to essentially running an efficient environment in Azure. And once again, it's not for newer environments only. We can also apply these services back to old ones. We'll talk about a couple strategies here in one of our future topics. But one of the other major items that we hear from our clients, as I was talking about earlier with our examples, is cost control. So Joe, why don't you take us through cost containment and cost control a little bit?
Absolutely. So this is actually a really good use case that sadly a lot of customers don't take advantage of, and it's implemented primarily with tags within Azure. So a tag in Azure is a string of data you can leverage to identify your resources, and this could be for a number of reasons. One of the big ones is for chargeback or some sort of correlation at the accounting level. So, for example, you might have a particular accounting code that's associated or project ID that you can then leverage when the bill comes in to tie this back to the the chargeback model for your particular organization. It easily correlates these costs as well within Azure's cost management and billing environment so that you can very quickly drill down to your costs by resource, by tag, by different environments, and it really helps you get a good picture of what your spend looks like and help rein that in if it's going further than you expected. It can also help justify needs where perhaps growth is driving an increase in demand and may need to justify additional funding. So this helps identify all of those different things. Another good use case of tagging, besides just the cost containment while we're on the topic, is that you can rapidly identify applications. So, for example, the app owner or the business criticality, if it's a tier one versus tier three application, or maybe the support resources that are involved. That's actually visible directly in the Azure portal, or if you're using APIs or automation, you can query that information. It gives you a method for finding out exactly who's responsible for a resource, and it's right in front of you at your fingertips while you're looking at the resource in question. And another good use case of tagging, I'll say too, is automation. Because of the information being provided on these resources, you can leverage automation in a number of ways. I have seen customers that have patching schedules based on automation. Once that's well vetted and tested, that can take a lot of load off of the staff that manages this on a day-to-day basis. So really good benefits to tagging, cost containment being one of the biggest ones, but many more things that come with that. So it's definitely a great benefit for landing zones. I would also say that another strong aspect to focus on would be security. So let me pass it back to you, Tom, and see what thoughts you may have on the security aspect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so you were talking a lot or a little bit about Azure policy and tagging and making sure that your resources are set up properly with those fields. But security obviously is another huge component of any landing zone, really any cloud deployment or really any infrastructure deployment anywhere. So by leveraging landing zones, we can actually utilize Azure Policy, which is an evaluation engine of a deployment, to ensure that everything is deployed properly. So, for example, one of the bigger ones that we see is restricting the use of public IPs. There's no reason for your domain controllers that are deployed on Azure to run public IP addresses. That's just you are just begging to get hacked or begging to be breached. So by using Azure Policy, we can actually enforce some of those security controls. And these can be either as part of your own custom controls. They can also be part of, say, the cloud security benchmark that Microsoft publishes. There are a lot of different ways that you can leverage these to ensure your environment is deployed securely. And it's not just for things like public IPs. We can also do things like require network security groups on your subnets. We can ensure that your blob storage accounts are not left open to the internet. There are a lot of different ways that Azure Policy can evaluate that environment to ensure that it is deployed in a best practices manner. And that's not even getting into other tools like Microsoft Defender for Cloud or MDC. Now, as we start talking about production environments, and even for some of our clients' non-production environments, we want to ensure that the security tooling is in place. And honestly, the first-party tooling through Microsoft Defender for Cloud is some of the best. As we start talking about servers, we can get into things like threat and vulnerability management, which is for vulnerability analysis. When you talk about EDR, we talk about antivirus, just overall security posturing of those services. But because MDC itself is so integrated with Azure, we can also integrate it with platform services like containers or Kubernetes or web applications or DNS or resource manager in general. So by having a strategy around enabling Microsoft Defender for Cloud for all these other services, we can ensure that they are deployed in a secured manner. And once they are deployed, they're being properly monitored. We can take this data and forward it out to a SIEM such as Microsoft Sentinel, or we can use Eyes on Glass directly in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So from a security perspective, it is most certainly important to ensure that that is a portion of the landing zone that that you are taking as part of your deployments. But all this comes in with standardization. So Joe, I think we definitely want to talk quite a bit about standardization because that is a huge part of our deployments and our clients' deployments leveraging landing zones.
Absolutely. So let's get into some standardization, especially for brownfield customers. When a brownfield environment has implementation of resources already in place, they're likely locked into perhaps a network scheme or different regions that are being used that have already been established. The problem that comes with that is twofold. One is maybe those aren't the ultimate regions and implementations you wanted to have. And also there can be a lot of sprawl beyond what you initially desired to have in place. So for example, the network ranges may not be arranged in a logical way that would yield themselves to policies, easy administration, talking through some of the infrastructure as code topics we'll hit on here in a little bit. It would be better to have them arranged in a more logical manner. And if this wasn't a landing zone type of deployment, then that may not have been followed from the beginning. So that's one of the considerations, as well as the regional deployments. So in a pseudotypical environment, there may be a primary and a DR location, but with applications, there can certainly be multiple regions involved. The goal is to identify what are your standardized regions for these types of deployments, and then stick with those so that we don't have sprawl going beyond it, which can also translate to network sprawl as well. So all of these things combined together can be handled with a landing zone type of deployment. In some cases, it might be something to consider for brownfield customers to look into maybe moving to a landing zone controlled subscription and standardizing on networks and the regions that are deployed. In some cases, you may not be able to move them, but you may still be able to rein in some of that sprawl that you may have in your environment. So in either situation, one of the great standardization areas of this is limiting the regions you can deploy into, as well as different SKUs of, say, VM sizes and so on, so that you keep things to a standardized model that's easier to support.
Yeah, and that's perfect. And so for any of our clients that do already have networks in Azure, as Joe was mentioning earlier, we can't necessarily re-IP things. They may already be locked in. Maybe they have static routes in their network that are really difficult to figure out or to undo or to update. So by leveraging a new IP scheme, we can still integrate that old IP scheme with that. As we start talking about hub and spoke topology, or if we really want to get into some really complex topics, we can talk about things like Azure Virtual WAN. We essentially can leverage that new IP scheme and then attach the old IPs into the new network to provide that cross-premises connectivity. We're going to talk a little bit about attrition and cap and grow strategies here in a future topic, but that is one of the ways that we can ensure that the old network gets put in place and is still accessible without fouling out the new network as well. One of the other things that Joe had brought up as well is regional selection and restrictions around things like VM SKUs and sizing. Now, I did just talk a little bit about Azure policy, but I'm going to double down on it because Azure policy is one of my favorite topics. As we were discussing earlier, Azure policy can be used to essentially implement a security baseline to do things like prevent public IPs from being deployed, make sure that network security groups are always being deployed as well. However, the other important thing around Azure policy is that you can also ensure that the rest of the environment is deployed not necessarily from a security perspective. So Joe was talking about tags earlier. So how do we ensure that those metadata fields are attached to all of our resources? Well, we can deploy a policy definition or a policy initiative to ensure that all resources, when they get deployed, have to have a specific policy in place. We can use them to determine what regions people are allowed to deploy into. If I'm a US-based company with only US-based users, then why would I ever want to deploy a server into South Korea or into the UAE or into the EU, where I could open myself up to compliance issues or other data sovereignty issues? So I can use Azure Policy to essentially ensure that when users or administrators go to deploy services, if they try to go into the wrong region, then it will just fail automatically and say, hey, by the way, you have to deploy in the United States, or more specifically, you have to deploy into East US or West US because these are our corporate standards. In addition, from a compliance perspective, there are a lot of built-in compliances that your GRC teams will really appreciate out of policy initiatives, such as ISO 27001, PCI, HIPAA, et cetera. Now, the great thing about these policies is they can all be deployed in audit-only mode. So as you start assuming your old resources into the landing zone, or as you start wanting to maintain these older resources, we can apply these policies to them. And all it's going to do is it's going to show you what's non-compliant or what is out of compliance for those specific HIPAA, PCI DSS, ISO 27001, et cetera. So we're not actually destroying anything. We're not turning anything off. We are just reporting on what in the old infrastructure is not compliant for those specific areas. Now, once you get a little bit further along and more mature, you may want to do things like fail deployments or do automated remediation, but that's not necessarily where we would recommend our clients with brownfield environments start. That being said, from an Azure policy perspective, as well as RBAC, that is very reliant on your resource hierarchy. That what really comes down to management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. So Joe, why don't you talk to us a little bit about management groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So management groups is a great way to take a lot of these concepts and implement them at scale. So many of the things that we've been talking about here today can be attached to individual subscriptions within Azure, but as your business needs grow, it can be difficult to manage those across multiple subscriptions. It's also more accident prone. It can be forgotten, or there could be a slight change or mistake made that makes it different from everything else. And ultimately, your compliance then suffers as a result. So a management group is a grouping of Azure subscriptions, and the groups themselves can be arranged in a hierarchy. So for example, you might have management groups that separate out different business units or departments, maybe even environments, whatever would suit your needs to separate policy as well as access. So when I say access, I mean specifically role-based access control or permissions to the resources in the environment. So management groups will allow you to attach policies as well as RBAC roles to standardize both across groups of subscriptions. And because the hierarchical structure of management groups, you can have very high level policies and RBAC roles that apply enterprise wide, and then be more granular as you step down that management group hierarchy to be more specific to those needs. I'll talk about or pass over to Tom to talk about some tooling options to help implement these in a more efficient manner.
Yep, I appreciate that. So as we've been talking, and hopefully you've been noticing a theme of today, is very much around standardization and ensuring that your environments get deployed the exact same way every single time. So there are a lot of tools that are available for us to make this work. And the two primary ones that we will start talking about fall into a class of tooling called infrastructure as code, or IAC. Now, there's a first-party infrastructure as code tool called ARM. There's a next revision of it coming out called Bicep that will be released hopefully here in the near future. But essentially what an infrastructure as code solution does is it allows you to define what needs to be deployed and then programmatically deploy it the same way every single time, maybe changing a couple parameters like the region it gets deployed into, or maybe the name of the resources, or how many resources get deployed. So maybe one time I want to deploy 5 servers, the next time I want to deploy 15, maybe the time after that I need 3 app services. These infrastructure as code solutions allow your administrators or whoever is maintaining your environment to standardize what those deployments look like and then store them in a template that your users or maybe your other virtual machine administrators or your SQL DBAs can use to standardize their deployments. Now, ARM is really great because it's very easy to work with and it is a Microsoft native tool. Now, the other really good thing about that is that ARM itself, as long as the resources already exist, will just provide a deployment. So if you already have a couple of virtual machines a couple of virtual networks in play that you want to leverage for maybe public services or private services, you can use an ARM template to make a reference to those virtual networks, and the VMs or the private endpoints that get deployed on top of them will just deploy and everything's happy and hunky-dory. That being said, the other tool that we use for infrastructure as code is another one called Terraform by HashiCorp. Now, Terraform itself has some benefits over ARM Bicep. We're not going to get into those because each one has their own sort of upsides and downsides depending on what you plan on using them for. But Terraform actually maintains a state of your environment as you do this deployment. Now, we really have to worry about this in a brownfield position because if I'm looking to attach new VMs to an old virtual network, or maybe I need to grab subscription information or information about an existing service, if Terraform is unaware of it, it can't actually leverage it. So what we need to do is we actually need to use Terraform and either get that data manually or import that data into the state file. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to allow Terraform to manage that resource. And then in the future, if you decide to make a change in your TF files, it's going to actually make those updates for you. Whereas if you were making a reference to it in your Terraform runbooks and then just let it run, it would actually throw an error that says that Terraform realizes that it's already there. It's not managing it. Too bad, so sad, we can't do the deployment. So that's the major consideration that we really have to worry about from an infrastructure as code perspective is how do we assume those old resources into our infrastructure as code solution to ensure that we can standardize those environments and standardize those deployments. And once again, ARM/Bicep and Terraform are two of the major areas or two of the major tools that we recommend, each of them having their own sort of upsides and downsides. But as Joe was talking about earlier as well, this really helps us determine whether or where things get deployed in the landing zone. So whether it's a new subscription, whether it's a new resource group, whether it's a new resource itself, these tools really help us with those deployments. Now, we also have to talk about the scale of these landing zones. And for that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joe to talk a little bit about enterprise scale landing zones or ESLZs versus really just standard landing zones.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So yeah, absolutely. There's a concept of enterprise scale landing zones where it takes the landing zone concepts we've been talking about here and it expands this into a bigger reach for something that is really geared towards larger enterprises to help control and centralize a lot of the resources that are used for landing zones as a whole. So, for example, there are some dedicated subscriptions by purpose for management, which was in an enterprise scale landing zone terms means this is your logging data, your log analytics workspaces, and so forth. There's an area for this logging data that is set aside for all of your landing zones to use. Same thing is true for identity. So whether you're using Active Directory domain services or something similar for the identity plane, you have a dedicated area to turn to, and you can locate related resources within there, control them similarly by policy and RBAC roles as well. That leaves room then for you to open up your actual landing zones to have multiple landing zones within a management group hierarchy. Those are typically at an enterprise scale broken out to what is called online, meaning it's internet facing, and what is typically referred to as corp or your internal only facing. The main reason for that is so we can leverage some of those policies we talked about today to minimize anything that is internet facing and restrict it only to the online branches that have landing zones within them. So that's a really good way of structuring a policy or group of policies for all of your landing zones to borrow from, while still giving them their own area that you can restrict policy and RBAC roles to. And finally, there's a management group that's typically used to decommission subscriptions. So when you are done with a particular subscription, whether it's an application or a dev test environment, you can simply move it underneath this management group, and the policies and RBAC roles kick in and tighten that up so that you can keep the resources around, but it minimizes any security risks or possibility of exposing it to other environments that you don't want it to. So that attrition brings us into a topic of an attrition plan. So, Tom, let me pass this over to you and then have you discuss an attrition plan and other concepts that go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So really to the meat of the discussion and why we want to talk about brownfield is, once again, how do we assume our existing environments into this brownfield environment? And the main way that we see our clients taking advantage of this is through an attrition plan, or what we generally refer to as a cap and grow sort of approach to our deployments. So as we start talking about what needs to be new and then what needs to stay around, we essentially want to cap the usage of our old services, and we want to grow the usage of our new services. Now, this can mean we stop deploying into an existing subscription. Maybe we stop using existing resource groups. But the main point of that is that we want to start leveraging our new stuff. So that means we want to deploy into the new subscriptions, our new virtual networks with the new network topology. We want to start using our newer naming convention and just kind of leave everything else that was deployed just there for a little bit. This gets people comfortable with the newer environment and ensures that people understand how to use it. They can work within the role-based access control that is applied. They can work within the Azure policy that's been deployed. They can work within a new environment that actually has guardrails around it, other than what they were doing previously in that wild west old environment. So as these things are being built out, it is extremely important to start using them as soon as possible. And then you essentially get to an inflection point where instead of maybe some stuff going old, some stuff going new, now everything goes into the newer environment because it's ready to go and everybody is aware of how it needs to run. So that is going to be the main sort of point around this cap and grow plan, is inserting that cap or applying that cap to that old environment. Now, the big question in that comes, what do we do with our old services? Because we're still going to have virtual machines, we're still going to have app services or storage accounts or other things in the old environment. So how do we ensure that we can bring those into the new landing zone? And depending on the service is going to give you a bit of a different answer. So you can either do things like take a virtual machine and replicate it into a new subscription using Azure Site Recovery. That's going to take it over bit for bit, and then that will ensure that it comes over and just operates like it did in the old environment. That's the easy way to do it. Maybe if that virtual machine is set to be decommissioned, you can just build a new one in the new environment and move over services manually. As we start talking about other platform services, that's where it depends on what you're using. So you can either replicate a SQL server from the old environment to the new. Maybe you want to replicate a web application between the old and the new and leverage things like Azure Traffic Manager in front of it, or global load balancers to send traffic between the two. There are multiple different ways that you can ensure that the old systems come into the new environment. The easiest way to do it is essentially removing the old services and just spinning them up on the new side. Once again, that is very dependent on what is being used, and is something that we would highly recommend that if you have questions about, you come to us and you ask about it. So with that, that is all that we wanted to discuss as part of our talk today around landing zones in your brownfield environments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to close us out. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom and Joe, for that great discussion around Azure landing zones. You still have a moment to enter any questions into the chat window. If you'd like to submit questions, please do so now. And we have about 5 or 10 minutes. We'll take pause and evaluate your questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So what we're going to do next is go through some questions from the audience that we have. And the first one that we have here is, what is the most difficult aspect of landing zones to move over from a brownfield environment?
Oh, that's a good one. So Yeah, we've talked a lot about a lot of different aspects today about landing zones, things like role-based access control, networking, policy, et cetera. In my experience, it's probably got to be role-based access control. So for a lot of my clients who aren't running landing zones, they're used to giving everybody pretty much owner permissions, contributor permissions, pretty much making them the kings of the castle with nothing really set or no real checks and balances. So by removing those permissions and then essentially moving toward more of a just-in-time, just enough administration model can get on people's nerves sometimes. It can make their jobs a little bit more difficult, unfortunately, if they're not sure what roles they need or things along those lines. We do also see a big implementation more recently of privileged identity management, or PIM, for Azure roles. So getting people kind of used to going into the portal and requesting the role and getting elevated is definitely something that we've seen a little bit of friction on. Um, Overall, at the end of the day, there are ways that you can make that a little bit easier. But really, I think getting people used to a new role-based access control mechanism or model is probably the more difficult one. The other piece to that, and then we'll go on to the next question, is also around things like automation. If you're using one of those infrastructure as code solutions that I was talking about earlier, there's a good chance you could be using a service principal to do your deployments, or hopefully you are. So make sure that that's permissioned properly. It can see everything. It can read all the data it needs. It can write all the services that it needs. Can take a little bit of time if you don't want to give it that overall owner permissions as well. So yeah, definitely role-based access control, I would say, is the biggest one.
Totally agree. Thanks, Tom. Another question we got is, can you provide an example of how landing zones have been used for one of our clients post-implementation to help reduce cloud cost?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked with a client several years ago in the financial services industry who had a pretty significant spend on their dev test environment. So they ended up moving up their entire development environment into Azure because they wanted to save costs on things like licensing, and obviously by shutting machines down and just using smaller services. Well, unfortunately, the smaller services and shutting machines down never actually really materialized. And they didn't really have an idea what was up there. They had developers who were deploying things, they had administrators who were deploying things. And really, it came down to, we don't really know what's out there. We don't really know what what can be shut down. So we came in and we had a discussion with them about landing zones. Now, luckily, their networking was set up really well, so we didn't really have to update that. But we went in and we updated role-based access control to reduce the permissions of people to make sure that they weren't being able to deploy things that they should not have been. We also implemented new Azure policies to make sure that they were actually restricting the size of resources that they were allowed to deploy. So for example, for the non-production environments, we limited them to actually was still standard HDD back at the time. There wasn't even a premium or a standard SSD, just to save on those costs. In addition, we put in policies like restricting the size of VMs, restricting the use of just overall more expensive workloads like DDoS protection, for example. Uh, and then we essentially set those from an audit policy to a deny policy. And then the biggest one that, Joe, we were talking about quite a bit today is tagging. We implemented a tagging policy to require tags on deployment. We integrated it into all of their infrastructure as code tools. And at the end of the day, we essentially enforce things like who is the owner, what is the application, um, what is the criticality. But more importantly, and Joe was talking about automation a little bit earlier, is we enforced a tag that set a shutdown schedule. Now, unless you had an exemption for things like domain controllers or firewalls or other 24/7 workloads, we enforced that a shutdown tag has to be on the machine. So what we did is we actually coupled that with Azure Automation to read the tag and determine what time these machines need to be shut down. So let's say we had 50 machines. We had 25 that got shut down at 7 p.m. We had 25 that got shut down at midnight, for example. We split those tags across the machines, had automation look for them, and then automatically shut them down. So by using this combination of Azure policy, Azure automation, as well as some other services and kind of tightening down role-based access control, we took their spend and dropped it by about 40 to 50%. And that was just from shutting machines down and making sure that there weren't super large resources running. So definitely a really good success story, and they're still a good client of ours today.
Excellent. So really good information. I hope that we've shared plenty of good knowledge and practices to use for many different clients. As a last question, I wanted to pose this one to you. With everything we've talked about here today, what if someone is not using landing zones, but they have existing Azure resources? What would be their path forward or their next step from here?
Yeah, I mean, their first step really is to take an inventory of what they have out there. So it's really hard to figure out what needs to migrate if you don't even know what's being deployed in the environment. So having a good idea of the things that are deployed, how they interact with each other, um, what can be shut down, those are going to be really important. There are a lot of really good first-party tools to figure this out. So things like Azure Resource Graph, which you can query the backend Azure APIs to see what's out there. Other tools like service maps, so you can see how all of your servers are interacting with each other. All these are really good tools to help you figure out what's out there, and not just what's out there, but how's everything all working kind of together and to make up an application itself. So that's the first step. And then the second step is figuring out what your landing zone is going to look like. So as we start talking about what landing zones are, obviously we've talked about a lot of things here. There are a lot of different components to them. So we highly recommend that you go through and design your landing zone rather than just trying to do it ad hoc. Generally, doing things ad hoc is probably what got you into this situation in the first place. So we want to make sure that as you're going through these things, that you're actually putting a lot of care and feeding and design into that landing zone. Once you do that, obviously doing the deployment of the landing zone, getting all the core components in place and constituent components, and then you can begin your migration. Once again, whether it's a virtual machine that you're replicating into it, whether it's a web application that you're redeploying, there are a bunch of different ways that you can do it. So with that, I'm actually going to have Sarah bring up our last slide, I believe, of the day that talks a little bit how Netrix approaches landing zones. So for those of you who are either with us live or watching this after the fact, one of the things that I will say is that Netrix has been doing landing zones for many, many years at this point. I think probably around 10 or so since the release of Azure Resource Manager. What we highly recommend for our clients is really what I had just laid out, is the capability of doing that design, which is the left box here, which is our advising and setting vision, which we go through a broad set of topics over the course of a couple weeks or so. Everything from role-based access control all the way out to PaaS services, governance, and even infrastructure as code, if you have a desire to do so. Once we have this in place, we highly recommend going into the implementation. For us, we have 3 different ways that we can implement landing zones that really will help fit into your team's needs. We start with either a guidance only, which for us is we are hands off. At the end of the day, your teams are responsible for doing the deployments. That gets them the hands-on that they need to become better at Azure and administration in general. And it also ensures that they know how to work it as we extricate ourselves from the environment and as they go to take it over as an administration service. So that guidance only is really just us working on the sidelines, but we can go all the way to the other side of a turnkey deployment. If you don't have services and staff that can manage an Azure environment or can stand it up, maybe you have time constraints or maybe you have a shortage of personnel, we offer turnkey Azure landing zone deployment assistance that's based completely off of what we design in phase 1. At this point in time, anything on the Azure side is the responsibility of our engineers, and we will work with you and provide status of how those deployments go. Now, we do still like to work alongside your staff to make sure that what we're deploying is in line with what you're expecting. So we can't say it's completely hands-off, but we do all of the heavy lifting for you. And then for our clients who prefer to have a little bit more of a working relationship or a little bit more experience, we do also have a light touch, which is in the middle here. That light touch deployment is essentially a combination of guidance and turnkey, where we will do the first 1 to 2 deployments with your engineers side by side to ensure they know what's going on. They ensure that they know what's being deployed and more importantly, why it's being deployed. And then we will let them go and run with it themselves. At that point, we will come back and ensure that what they deployed matches best practice and matches exactly what we're expecting. So at that point, we know that everything is done properly. And once again, that environment gets handed over at the end. Now, the other thing that I will say is that Netrix, as well as providing these professional services, is a full managed services shop. So whether you are also looking to secure this environment and monitor it through services like Microsoft Sentinel, or whether you just need services all up in managing it and ensuring that it's operating efficiently, we also have a dedicated managed services team that can help in the ongoing method as well, or ongoing maintenance of the environment. My apologies, to ensure that everything operates and is secured properly. So with that, that is all that I believe we had to go over today. So we very much thank everybody for joining us and harnessing the power of landing zones for brownfield cloud environments. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. We highly appreciate it. And with that, I will let everybody go a little bit early to enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.